Marvel Studios is returning to one of the most beloved cartoons of my childhood, featuring a team of outcasts who saved the world on a daily basis, even though they were scorned by the world. A group of people born with amazing powers who posed the question of whether they were the next step in human evolution. They were called mutants or freaks, but to many others they were called icons or legends. I am of course talking about the X-Men. Specifically the animated series from the 90s, which was full of action and adventure, but also taught many children about the dangers of hatred and how love and acceptance are what's needed in the world. The show was massively popular, as well as applauded for its message. But what was the story of its origin, and why did it leave us in the first place? The X-Men were created by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, debuting in the X-Men #1 in September 1963. The book was not a hit. In fact, for many years, it was the lowest-selling comic being published by Marvel. Even though there were times when the sales would spike, the book would eventually stop publishing new stories altogether. Then in 1975, sales and interest in the characters would explode with the publication of New X-Men #1. A comic that would introduce such iconic characters as Storm and Wolverine. Soon the golden era of the X-Men would begin, when comic book legends John Byrne and Chris Claremont took over the book. After that, the X-Men became arguably the most popular comic book characters that Marvel ever made. By the 90s, Jim Lee had taken over illustrations and created what most people consider the classic look of the X-Men to be. I could go on and on about my thoughts on the X-Men comics, but that would be a whole other video. So as you can imagine, the popularity of these characters made Marvel want to cash in on adapting them to other media. In the 1980s, many of the characters would appear on the popular cartoon Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, with one of the lead characters, Iceman, being an original member of the X-Men, and another character, Firestar, also having ties as well. It was around this time that Margaret Loesch became the president and the chief executive officer of Marvel Entertainment Group. Loesch was a fan of X-Men since she felt the concept of mutants could appeal to both children and teenagers. In her opinion, the idea of characters who were ostracized and couldn't fit in was a universal concept. So she would produce a failed TV pilot called Pride of the X-Men. It was never picked up because Marvel Entertainment was sold off due to their financial issues at the time. I grew up watching this pilot when it was released back on VHS, and though I personally enjoyed it, hearing Wolverine with an Australian accent was, well,
weird.
Side note for you, the director and producer of the X-Men animated series would go on to say that the reason Wolverine had an Australian accent was because an executive forced them to change his voice. The reason was that at the same time, Crocodile Dundee was huge with American audiences. Years later, Loesch became the head of the Fox Children's Network, which would eventually be rebranded as Fox Kids. And she immediately commissioned an X-Men cartoon. The heads at Fox at first told her no, but she persisted. They eventually agreed to authorize it, but that if it failed, they would fire her. And she agreed. Sidney Iwanter was the vice president of Fox at the time, who was put in charge of gathering the team to make this show a reality. Iwanter had worked with Eric Lewald on Beetlejuice, the animated series, and knew that he could trust Eric to take the project seriously. Lewald told him that he wasn't familiar with the X-Men, but Iwanter insisted that he be involved. So he agreed. Sidney and Eric Lewald have said that they used Pride of the X-Men as an example of what not to do themselves. Larry Houston, the director of Pride of the X-Men, said that the X-Men animated series was his way to make up for the mistakes that Pride of the X-Men had made. That pilot became a cautionary tale for Lewald and his team of what could happen if they let the bigwigs get too involved in the series development. Surprisingly, the one person that had to be cut out of the creative process was Stan Lee. At this point in Marvel history, the X-Men had changed drastically from their early days back when Stan wrote for them. Lee wanted to make the show more like the early days of Marvel, full of puns and silliness from the 1960s. He also wanted each episode to have a live-action introduction by himself with an educational message at the end of the episode, in the same vein of G.I. Joe or Silverhawks. He wasn't a fan of the modern X-Men, so he wasn't interested in the serious social themes that they wanted to delve into. Lawald had to make the difficult decision to diplomatically tell Stan Lee that he shouldn't be involved in the show's production, so Stan took a back seat and would end up having very little input on the show. One of the people involved in Pride of the X-Men was producer and writer Larry F. Houston, the first ever black storyboard artist to be hired in Hollywood. He was a huge comic book fan who had dreamed of bringing Marvel superheroes to the animation medium. When Loesch became president, she brought in Larry as the series' animation director. Thankfully, he loved the X-Men and would frequently bring in his own comics for references to help the writers and animators. Many episodes would feature Easter eggs that Larry was responsible for. If you watch the show, you will see many Marvel characters showing up in the background or having small roles. Houston was able to do this by using the characters without naming them. So if a script had background characters or small roles that would, for example, say Morph turns into mutant number 1 and 2, Larry learned that he could just insert any Marvel character in there and no one would be the wiser. So characters who had no names were not being checked due to the ignorance of the network executives. But if you watch the show, you can spot such characters as Ghost Rider, Deadpool, and the Punisher. One of my favorite moments was in an episode called Mojo Vision, which had a crowd cheering as the X-Men are about to be killed. If you look carefully at this crowd, you can see Jack Kirby. Houston also helped many of the writers by teaching them about the lore of the X-Men, since many had never read the comics. Larry's philosophy was that you should try to adapt the stories as close to the source material as possible. There's a reason why it's so popular. Other than changing the stories to fit the narrative, there shouldn't be any big reason to deviate. Essentially, as the saying goes, if it's not broke, then don't fix it. The designs of the characters were based on Jim Lee's massively popular design during his X-Men run with Chris Claremont, although other characters that appeared in the series, such as Cable, were taken from Rob Liefeld's contributions to the X-Men universe. Not everything was perfect though. All these years later, I cannot get over Archangel's horrible yellow eyebrows. Originally, Eric Lawald and Larry Houston had a problem getting a voice cast for the show. The people that the network used to cast many of their cartoons did not understand what kind of show they were casting. So the initial voice actors were told to do a similar style to something like Scooby-Doo or Super Friends. The concept of a serious superhero show was beyond their comprehension. So Lawald and the rest of the crew had to fly to Toronto to explain what they wanted. Since the recording was done in Canada, Canadian actors were cast in the show. So let's break them down, shall we? Let's start with the head honcho himself, Professor Charles Xavier, better known as Professor X, voiced by Cedric Smith. He was a folk singer who would eventually become an actor. For many years, I always heard Cedric's voice as the Professor whenever I read the comics. I love the gravitas of his voice, the intelligence, and the kindness. His final episode in particular always chokes me up. Funny enough, Cedric was married to Catherine Disher, the actress who had voiced Jean Grey. The leader of the X-Men was Cyclops, voiced by the late, great Norm Spencer. I don't care what anyone else says, Norm Spencer is the voice of Cyclops. Well, for me at least. I don't want to be mean and say that other actors who have taken over the visor are inferior. I just feel like no one has ever been able to replicate what Norm did with his noble portrayal of the X-Men's leader. I'm very curious to see how Ray Chase will do as the new voice of Cyclops in X-Men 97. Spencer would start in radio as a writer, but would slowly transition into acting. When he auditioned for Cyclops, he had no idea who the X-Men were. During his audition, he tried to portray him in a loud, melodramatic voice, but the voice director stopped him. He said that what he wanted was just Norm's natural voice, just slightly elevated. After the show, Norm would continue on with voiceover work, and even portrayed Cyclops for the awesome Marvel vs. Capcom video games. Sadly, he would pass away in August 2020, but will always be remembered fondly by fans such as myself. The love of Cyclops and Wolverine's lives, Jean Grey, was played by Catherine Disher. Catherine still happens to be acting today, with her most popular role currently being that of Mayor Martha Tinsdale on The Good Witch. But I still remember her from her role on Forever Knight as Dr. Natalie Lambert. Disher had been working in animation for years before X-Men, and was very impressed at how adult this show was, as she'd been used to working on cartoons meant for children. So this was a big change of pace for her. I still wish that more interpretations of Jean Grey in the films would take inspiration from her portrayal of the role. She was the glue of the team. Everyone would turn to Jean whenever they needed someone to listen to them. She was the delegator, the heart of the team. But of course, we cannot talk about the X-Men without discussing the famous adamantium lace mutant Logan, aka Wolverine, voiced here by Cal Dodd. Cal was also a musician who came from a musical family. His mother was a music teacher and his brother was a vocalist who worked with Meatloaf. Cal started out as a host for the very popular Canadian variety show Circus, after which he would sing jingles for commercials. One of these jingles was for Chrysler, which featured him singing in a gravelly voice. The casting director heard this voice and reached out to him, since it was the exact type of voice they wanted. When Dodd came in, they told him that Wolverine should sound like Clint Eastwood. He then decided to mix in the voice of the famous DJ Wolfman Jack as well, which wound up making Larry Houston and the other producers laugh. During the audition, he had to perform a scene where Wolverine would fight Sabretooth. Not knowing anything about the comics, Dodd said, "Wolverine? Sabretooth? Is this an animal cartoon?" Larry and the others had to explain to the confused Dodd who the characters were. After that, Cal then performed the classic line,
"All right, you egg-sucking piece of gutter trash. You always liked pushing around people smaller than you. Well, I'm smaller. Try pushing me!"
When they heard him say that, their jaws dropped, and they immediately cast him. For the famous Cajun card-throwing mutant Gambit, Chris Potter was cast. Chris was an actor who had performed in small roles in Canadian TV. However, Potter had no experience with voice acting, so he was very insecure while he was working on the show. For the voice of Gambit, he mixed a French-Canadian accent with a Southern one. Gambit would end up becoming a fan-favorite character with his charming and playful attitude. Funny story for you, Chris Potter would wind up auditioning for Cyclops for the very first live-action X-Men movie. In later interviews, he said he never thought he would have been a great Cyclops, and he hoped they would cast him as Gambit in the sequels. But as you all know, Gambit has yet to appear in any X-Men live-action movie.
Now, Bob, you listen to me.
Like I said, he never appeared in any X-Men movie. Period. One of the iconic characters in the series was the Flying Southern Belle Rogue, played by Lenore Zann. Zann had been working in Canadian TV and film for years. Her casting story was pretty amusing.
Hearing about the show was from my Canadian Toronto agent who said, "Lenore, they're doing this cartoon series. It doesn't have a title yet. It's just they're calling it like a Project X, like it's a secretive project. And you've got to go down and audition because they want a woman with a low, sexy, husky voice who can do a Southern accent." And I had played Southerners on movies and television a few times at that point in time. And I said, well, I don't know if I'm really interested in doing cartoons. I'm a serious actress, I do movies and television and theater, that was the attitude at the time. So I didn't go to the auditions. But a few months later, my agent called me again and she said, "Lenore, would you please get over to these auditions? They're having callbacks and they still haven't found the right actor for the part because it's you." So I went down and I saw a picture of Rogue from a cell just standing there, with her hand on her hip and the attitude. And I went, oh yeah, I can do that. And then I walked in the booth, and then it was a little tiny monologue of, I remember I had me a boyfriend when I was 13. Had me a boyfriend till I kissed him. Poor boy went into a coma for 3 days. And I heard these guys in the LA booth, miles away, screaming and going, that's the voice, don't let her leave.
Lenore played Rogue as a flirty southern badass, but at the same time was able to portray her tragic backstory. Rogue's most heartbreaking aspect was that she could not touch anyone due to her powers, alienating her from everyone and depriving her of love. Since the show ended, Lenore Zann has become a real-life hero herself, working in the Canadian Parliament, fighting for the environment, women's rights, education, and a variety of other noble causes. But she still takes time out to go to conventions and will be returning to the role of Rogue in X-Men 97. But my favorite character would have to be Storm, played by 2 actresses, Iona Morris and Alison Seeley-Smith, both of whom did an amazing job. I loved Storm. Her lines were full of melodrama that were so fun to hear.
Storm, mistress of the elements, commands you to release that child.
Lighten up on the speeches, sugar.
I summon the full power of the storm! Rise, fog, and divert our enemy from her path! Storm, your master commands!
Iona Morris said that she portrayed Storm as if she were a queen, but eventually would end up being replaced by Alison Seeley-Smith, because Morris was American. So it became too expensive to keep her on since the residuals paid out differently for American actors than Canadian ones. So Canadian actress Alison Seeley-Smith was brought on. And it's weird, I personally never noticed the difference between their voices. Both of the actresses are amazing and are still working today in both voice work and live action roles. Another legendary voice actor was George Buzza, who portrayed the charming blue-furred genius Hank Beast McCoy. Buzza was the only one on the cast who knew who the X-Men were, as he had been collecting comics since he was 12 years old. George had been working in Canada as an actor for years, one of his most memorable roles being that of Tunner Edison on the popular Canadian sitcom Manic Mansion. While working for a children's theater touring production, he would be recommended for voice acting roles by his friend. One of his first gigs would be doing voices in the Star Wars universe, voicing many characters in the Droids and Ewoks cartoons from the 1980s. When he auditioned for the Beast role, the casting agents kept the details of the show secret. But when Buzza was given the script to read for his audition, he realized that the role was for Beast almost immediately. His mission was to get the role, and would play Beast as an intelligent and patient man who didn't get upset over all the bigotry he experienced. A perfect example of such patience was in the first season, as Hank spent almost the entire 13 episodes in jail. You would think that this would make him depressed or angry, but Hank trusted that things would work out. There were times when he was given the chance to break out of jail, but he knew that his trial would be used to teach humanity that not all mutants were evil. Cool little fact here, George had a cameo in the first X-Men movie, as a trucker who gives Rogue a lift to Canada. Like many other kids who watched the show, I identified the most with Jubilee. She was just an awkward kid who was a fan of the X-Men herself, and was gung-ho to have some adventures with them. Allison Court would provide the voice for the fireworks shooting teenage mutant. Court had been working in the entertainment industry since she was a child, with roles in such classic movies as Follow That Bird. Then she began to do voice work on many classic cartoons, one of her biggest roles being that of Lydia Dietz on the much-loved Beetlejuice animated series. Funny enough, it was because of Beetlejuice that almost stopped her from landing the role of Jubilee. Sidney Iwanter had been working on Beetlejuice during its run, and he was sick of her voice, telling Eric Lewald and Larry Houston that he didn't care who they cast as Jubilee just so long as it wasn't Allison Court. So someone else would be cast, but that actress dropped out at the last minute, which is when Allison was called to fill in. Since the original X-Men has ended, Court has worked steadily for years, with such live-action roles as the Big Comfy Couch, and other voice work such as being the voice for Claire Redfield in the Resident Evil games. Some of the villains from X-Men were also performed by very talented actors. Battlestar Galactica's Lord Baltar himself, John Colicos, was the voice of the evil first mutant, Apocalypse. Christopher Britton was the voice for the sadistic Mr. Sinister. And finally, the actor who played Lord Dredd on Captain Power, David Hamblin, portrayed the most complex evil mutant in X-Men history, Magneto. The X-Men series would also feature some great guest stars such as Cable and Bishop. Angel would have a great storyline in particular about being changed by Apocalypse to Archangel, and his struggles to heal from... I'm sorry, look at those things. They look like two caterpillars decided to camp out on his forehead. Oh, and also Nightcrawler was used particularly well in this amazing episode, which would feature Wolverine struggling with faith in a higher power. Much like the Batman animated series, the X-Men series was unique in its adult stories. The writers were told that they should write these shows for themselves, not for children. Many of these episodes would be taken straight from the comics. Some of my favorites being Days of Future Past, and to this day, the best adaptation of the Dark Phoenix saga. Some other memorable episodes are A Rogue's Tale and Time Fugitives. But in an ironic twist of fate, the show wound up creating a classic X-Men comic book event. Just like when the Spider-Man animated series had inspired the Spider-Verse, the episode One Man's Worth would do the very same. One Man's Worth revolved around a time traveler who would kill Professor X and alter the timeline to create one that would have a devastating war between the mutants and the humans that has practically destroyed the world and will lead to the leader of the Sentinels, Master Mold, to now control humanity. This would inspire the now iconic Age of Apocalypse storyline in the X-Men comics, with many of the same character designs even being used in the comic books. Surprisingly though, the X-Men animated series almost did not make it to air. You see, the Korean animation studio that was used, called AKOM, dropped the ball and handed in the third episode with too many errors. Since almost the entire episode had to be redone, AKOM refused to correct it, mostly due to Saban not communicating with them regularly, as Saban wanted to save as much money as possible, and told this to AKOM, so they would cut corners and the result would be an episode that couldn't be aired. Had this company known the importance of quality for this series, this may have been avoided. It's understandable that they gave so much pushback. They would essentially have to redo the work from scratch for little to no money. Eventually, Fox had to step in and threaten to fire AKOM in order to resolve the matter. But the result was a major delay in production. That was a huge problem since the X-Men was a serialized show and not self-contained like many standard cartoons of the time. That meant releasing reruns of the episodes or airing them out of order would not work. It would run the risk of confusing new viewers. So Margaret had to make the hard decision to hold back the release date of X-Men from September to January. She had to tell the advertisers that the show was delayed, which was a hard conversation to have, since there was going to be so much money lost. But she managed to make them understand how important the quality of the episodes had to be. The reason why the X-Men property was so popular was that fans could always count on how cool that this show looked. If they rushed it, then it wouldn't make the profit which they wanted, and the advertisers begrudgingly agreed. But Margaret had an idea. She would show the first 2 episodes as a sneak preview in October that would be aired on prime time as a special event. This was a huge hit in the ratings, being so big that in November, Fox Kids would hold a contest for kids to get the chance to pick a favorite cartoon for them to rerun, and the X-Men beat out the other cartoons by a landslide. When the rest of the show began to air in January, it put Fox on the map. And looking back, you can see how special this show really was. the pilot being the perfect example of how X-Men broke new ground, with a member of their team dying at the very start. An original character called Morph was created and set up as the team's comic relief, but in the pilot during a fight with the Sentinels, he sacrificed his life to save that of Wolverine. Even though the character would eventually be brought back in the second season, the fact that he died in the first place was unheard of back then. It's funny that the only reason why Morph was created was because the character that was supposed to die was Thunderbird, a nod to the original comics. But Lawald and Houston realized that to introduce the first Native American superhero and then immediately kill him off would be problematic. But how could I not mention one of the most memorable parts of this show, the theme song? X-Men the Animated Series had an iconic theme song that is right up there with Batman the Animated Series and the 1960s Spider-Man cartoon. This song was created by Ron Wasserman, who at the time worked at Saban creating music for their shows. In fact, he was the man who created the famous Power Rangers theme song. For the X-Men theme, Wasserman said that he had been working on an original song for another project, so he decided to modify it with a bass line, and the rest, as they say, is history. The song has seen a particular resurgence nowadays, now that the X-Men are poised to enter the MCU. Unfortunately, it's also been accused of plagiarism. On October 9, 2019, Hungarian immigrant Zoltán Kriszko sued Marvel, Saban, Fox, and other parties because they said the theme song was stolen from a Hungarian cop show called Linda from 1984. Here is the original theme song from Lydia. And I have to admit, it does sound pretty similar to the X-Men animated series theme song. But I honestly think that's just a coincidence. I'm sure if you throw a rock, you can find other songs that are just as close. Still, the lawsuit would end up being settled in 2021. Merchandising was always a bit of an issue, with many requests to incorporate toys and other products for the show. A notable story regarding this was when the network tried to pressure them into incorporating Wolverine walkie-talkies. Other products they wanted to sneak into the show were things like pajamas and shower curtains. But eventually the network figured out that the best product to sell would be the toys of the characters, and the vehicles they drove, such as the Blackbird. Another funny behind-the-scenes fact was that the team was originally only hired for 13 episodes. So when those 13 episodes were finished airing, they were let go. But when the network realized how popular the show had become, they had to go back and ask everyone to return. As you can imagine, it was a pretty awkward conversation. X-Men the Animated Series would last a total of 5 seasons. One more season than anyone expected. By the 5th season though, the show had deteriorated in quality due to Saban constantly cutting cost. So on September 20th, 1997, the final episode of X-Men the Animated Series would air. And we said goodbye to our favorite animated mutants. Until March 20th, 2024, when X-Men 97 will premiere on Disney+. Hopefully by the time this episode airs, this new series will end up living up to the original. But even if it doesn't, the X-Men animated series will always be a game changer in the world of animation. The show remains as good today as it was 32 years ago. Jesus Christ, I'm old. So if you would like to go back to the world of Homo Superiors, then sign yourself up for Disney Plus and get ready to experience the adventures that await. Just be sure to avoid getting adamantium into your system. I'm Jesse Shade speaking on behalf of David Arroyo for JoBlo.com, and thanks again for watching our show.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo was created by movie fans for movie fans, and we appreciate your support.